My son said, "Your room stinks." So I took his inheritance and bought myself a dream home. That sentence might sound like the start of a bitter comedy, but for me, it was the turning point of a lifetime built on sweat, sacrifice, and silent endurance. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand the kind of person I am before you can grasp why that one cruel remark from my own child changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I've never been the type to chase after luxury. My life has been marked by simplicity, not because I hated extravagance, but because I believed that every dollar saved today would secure my son's tomorrow. When my husband passed away years ago, I promised myself that I would provide for our boy no matter the cost. I worked long hours at jobs most people would have turned their noses up at, cleaning houses, waiting tables, standing behind a counter for hours on end, taking double shifts when no one else wanted them. That was my life. I came home exhausted, my back aching, my hands rough from labor, but I held on to the hope that all of this sacrifice was building something better for him. I lived modestly, too modestly by most people's standards. My house was small, and my bedroom barely larger than a storage closet, but I kept it tidy and clean. The furniture was second-hand, the paint faded in places, and the mattress had long since lost its softness. Still, I never complained. I thought of it as temporary, a stepping stone while I squirreled away every cent I could. I told myself that my son's future would justify all these little discomforts. People often told me I was too selfless. Friends warned me, saying, "You can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself too." But I brushed off their advice because I believed parents were meant to sacrifice for their children. I thought my son would grow up one day and see the truth behind my choices. I imagined him understanding that I gave up my comfort so he could thrive. But as the years went by, I began to notice things that unsettled me. My son grew comfortable, far too comfortable, living a life that I had made easy for him. He never knew hunger, never knew the grind of endless labor. He didn't understand what it felt like to count pennies and wonder if you could stretch a loaf of bread for one more day. I had shielded him from all of it, thinking I was protecting him, but in reality, I was building a wall between us. I was proud of the inheritance fund I had carefully built, proud that my son would step into adulthood with a security I never had. Yet beneath that pride was a nagging doubt. Would he ever respect the sacrifices that created it? At the time, I still believed the answer was yes. My son grew up with everything I never had. From the day he was born, I vowed he would never experience the gnawing hunger of an empty stomach, the shame of wearing worn-out shoes, or the humiliation of begging for second chances when money ran dry. And I kept that promise. He had new clothes every school year, shiny gadgets before they were popular, and the security of a roof over his head without ever worrying how the bills were paid. But the more I gave, the less he seemed to appreciate. By the time he was in his teenage years, the gratitude that once sparkled in his little boy eyes had turned into something sharp and dismissive. Instead of thanking me for the meals I scraped together after a 10-hour shift, he would push the plate away and say, "Ugh, can't we ever have something decent?" I told myself it was a phase, that adolescence came with its storms, but deep down, his words stung. As he grew older, that entitled streak only deepened. He strutted around the house like a guest in a hotel, expecting me to wash his clothes, cook his meals, and clean up after him. When I asked for help, even with small tasks, he'd roll his eyes as if I had insulted him. "That's your job, not mine," he'd say, throwing his laundry on the floor. He spoke to me as though he were above me, not the other way around. The irony was bitter. Everything he had came from my sacrifices, yet he acted as though I owed him more. I had worked my body into exhaustion so he could study in peace, so he could dream bigger than I ever could, and still he carried himself with arrogance. He thought the world was his to claim, never realizing how much of it had already been handed to him on a silver platter. It wasn't just the way he treated me at home. I saw it in how he treated others too. Waiters, cashiers, janitors, people I identified with deeply. He dismissed them with the same disdain. If his order was late, he snapped. If something wasn't to his liking, he complained loudly, as if the world should bend around his whims. I recognized the danger in that behavior, the way entitlement corrodes the soul. Friends of mine used to tell me, "He's just spoiled. He'll grow out of it." I clung to that hope, but as the years passed, he didn't soften. If anything, he hardened. He wanted more, expected more, and gave nothing in return. And still, I kept saving. I told myself, maybe when he sees the inheritance I've built for him, he'll finally understand what I've done. I believed that gift would humble him, make him proud of the parent who stood behind him. But instead of gratitude, all I received was scorn. The day it happened started like any other. I had just come home from work, still in my uniform, shoes covered with the dust of long hours, and the ache in my back reminding me I had pushed myself too far again. I wanted nothing more than to retreat into my small room, the one place in the house that was truly mine. It wasn't much. A narrow bed, a second-hand dresser, faded curtains that had seen better days. The walls carried the scent of age, and though I scrubbed and aired it as often as I could, the years left their mark. My son followed me down the hallway that evening, scrolling through his phone, his voice carrying that sharp edge of sarcasm he wore so well. "You really need to fix up this house," he muttered, barely looking at me. "It's embarrassing." I forced a smile, choosing not to bite back. I had heard worse. But when I opened the door to my room, and he leaned against the frame, wrinkling his nose, the words that slipped out of his mouth cut deeper than any insult I had ever endured. "God, your room stinks." He said it with a sneer, not as a joke, not as an offhand comment, but as a deliberate jab. His lip curled, his eyes filled with disdain, as if I were some pathetic stranger instead of the parent who had given him everything. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob, my heart thudding in my chest. I looked around my room, the bed with its thin quilt, the small desk stacked with old bills and notes, the tiny window that struggled to let in light, and for the first time I saw it through his eyes. Humble, dull, worn, a reflection of years of sacrifice, but to him it was nothing more than filth. "I keep it clean," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He snorted, scrolling back to his phone. "Yeah, sure, whatever you say. It still reeks." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, clutching at words that refused to come. I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. His voice echoed in my head, that cruel tone weaving into my bones. "My room stinks. My life stinks. My sacrifices stink." That was what he had meant, whether he realized it or not. I had endured insults before, from strangers, from customers who thought a service worker was beneath them, but from my own son, it was different. It was betrayal. Every late night, every coin saved, every comfort denied had led to this moment, where he stood above me and sneered at the very life that kept him afloat. It was then I felt something shift inside me, A seed planted, small but undeniable. The thought that maybe I had given too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the cracked ceiling, the words looping endlessly in my head. Your room stinks. Such a small sentence, so easily spoken, but it sank its claws into me and refused to let go. I had heard insults before in my life, from strangers who didn't know me, from bosses who saw me as disposable, from people who looked down on me because of the jobs I worked. Those wounds healed quickly because I could remind myself that they didn't know my story. But when those words came from my own son, they pierced through every defense I had built. He did know my story. He knew the sacrifices I had made. He had seen me drag myself through the door after 12-hour shifts, still managing to put dinner on the table. He knew that my modest room was not a reflection of laziness, but of relentless saving for his future. And yet, to him, it was nothing more than a joke, a chance to sneer and feel superior. That was the part that hurt the most. He didn't just fail to appreciate my sacrifices, he dismissed them entirely. As I lay there, I thought about the nights I went without dinner so he could have a full plate. I thought about the shoes I patched and wore long past their time so he could have new ones every school year. I thought about birthdays I spent alone, working extra shifts so I could afford to buy him the gifts he wanted. Every memory felt like a cut, reopened and raw, because all of it had been dismissed with that one cruel sentence. The silence of the night made the pain louder. I heard the creak of the floorboards as he walked to the kitchen, probably grabbing snacks without a thought to who paid for them. I heard him laugh softly at whatever was on his phone, carefree and comfortable, while I lay awake with my chest heavy, wondering if my sacrifices had ever meant anything to him at all. A part of me wanted to believe it was just another careless remark, something he hadn't meant. But his tone had been deliberate, his sneer sharp. It was contempt, not carelessness. And I realized then that what I had been avoiding for years was true. My son didn't respect me. Not as a parent, not as a person. The tears came silently. I cried into my pillow, not just from sadness, but from a bone-deep exhaustion. I had carried him on my back for so long, and now I wondered if he would ever see me as anything more than a stepping stone. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question that had lingered in the back of my mind for years. What if he never would? It was in that dark, sleepless night that my heart began to harden. As I lay there in the silence, his words echoing like a cruel refrain, my mind wandered backward, unbidden, to the years that had shaped me, the years that had shaped him. I remembered the first job I took after his father passed away. I was barely holding myself together, grief clawing at me every day, but I couldn't afford the luxury of mourning. There was rent to pay, food to buy, a baby to raise. I scrubbed floors in office buildings at night, the smell of bleach clinging to my skin as I dragged heavy buckets from room to room. My knees ached, my hands cracked, but every paycheck meant diapers and formula. That was all that mattered. When he grew older, the expenses only grew with him. New clothes for school, field trips, sports fees, the endless parade of things children need to feel like they belong. I picked up shifts, waiting tables, smiling through exhaustion, balancing trays that felt like bricks. I wore a uniform stained with grease and sweat, enduring the sharp voices of customers who thought nothing of belittling me. At the end of each shift, I stuffed the tips into an envelope, whispering to myself that someday it would be worth it. There were winters when I patched my old coat instead of buying a new one, so he could have the latest jacket that all his friends were wearing. I remember walking home in the biting wind, my fingers numb, hugging myself for warmth, while he ran ahead in his brand new sneakers, laughing. He never knew that I had eaten only half a bowl of rice that night so he could have seconds. He never knew how often I sat at the kitchen table late at night, adding and subtracting bills, deciding which ones could be delayed without losing the lights or the heat. Vacations were a dream I never allowed myself to entertain. Every dollar I could save went into an account, his account. I told myself that one day, when he was grown, he would look at that inheritance and know what it meant. He would know it was built from nights of aching feet, from meals skipped, from birthdays I spent working instead of celebrating. I clung to that vision like a lifeline. I sacrificed luxuries without a second thought. No new furniture, no updated appliances, no dinners out unless it was his birthday. I lived as though I was invisible, my own needs buried beneath his, and all the while, I told myself it was love, that it was what any parent would do. But lying there that night, with his sneer still fresh in my mind, I wondered if I had misunderstood love. I had given up so much of myself for him, but had I raised him to value it? Or had I only taught him to take without giving, to expect without appreciating? That thought was heavier than all the shifts I had ever worked. By morning, the sting of his words had not faded. If anything, they had grown sharper with the passing hours. I went through my routine, preparing breakfast, tidying the kitchen, and checking the bills stacked neatly on the counter, but everything I touched felt heavier. My body moved out of habit, but my mind replayed the sneer, the curl of his lip, the way his voice dripped with contempt. I tried, as I often did, to excuse him. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't realize how cruel he sounded. Maybe he was just careless with words. But the truth is, deep down, I knew better. I had seen it building for years. The dismissive tone, the way he brushed me off when I asked him to help, the entitlement in his voice whenever he spoke of his future, as though it was something I owed him. That morning, as I watched him stride into the kitchen, yawning, phone in hand, not even glancing at me, it hit me with painful clarity. He didn't respect me, not as a parent, not as a human being. To him, I was little more than a provider, the one who made sure there was food in the fridge, money in the bank, and an inheritance waiting like a prize at the end of his youth. He sat down at the table, scrolling through his phone while I placed a plate of food in front of him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even look up. He shoveled a forkful into his mouth, muttered that it was cold, and kept scrolling. And in that moment, something inside me cracked. I realized that he didn't see me as someone who had worked herself to the bone to give him everything. He saw me as an obstacle to endure until I passed, leaving him with what he believed was rightfully his. I was a stepping stone, nothing more. The weight of that truth was crushing. For so long, I had lived for him, telling myself that one day he would understand, one day he would recognize the sacrifices I made. But looking at him then, hunched over his phone, indifferent to my presence, I understood that day would never come. He wasn't waiting to thank me. He was waiting to inherit. I looked at his face, illuminated by the glow of the screen, and I didn't see my little boy anymore. I didn't see the child who once clung to my hand or cried when I kissed his scraped knees. I saw a young man who believed he was owed everything, who had no idea what it meant to work, to struggle, to sacrifice. The realization left me cold. I had poured my life into him, and he saw me only as a source of money, a living wallet, and for the first time I felt the bitterness rise in me, quiet but undeniable. I had spent years preparing for his future, but what about mine? After that morning, something shifted inside me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, not the kind of change you announce with raised voices or slammed doors. No, this was quieter, deeper, like a slow turning of the tide. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think not about him, but about me. I sat at the kitchen table one evening after he had gone out, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. My hands rested on the stack of bills, but instead of calculating his tuition, his clothing, his endless wants, my thoughts drifted somewhere else. I imagined what my life would look like if I stopped living only for him. What if the money I had worked myself ragged to save wasn't his, but mine? The thought startled me. For years I had lived with a single focus: prepare for his future, ensure his security. It was almost a religion, a ritual of self-denial and sacrifice. But now, sitting in the dim light, I realized that in giving everything to him, I had left nothing for myself. My room, the one he mocked so easily, was proof of that. 4 walls closing in, the faded smell of years gone by, a mirror that reflected only exhaustion. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine something different. A room with sunlight streaming in, a mattress that didn't sag in the middle, a closet with clothes I didn't have to mend, a home that felt like a reward, not a punishment. For the first time in my life, I let myself picture it. And in that imagining, I felt a flicker of warmth I hadn't felt in years. When he returned home that night, laughing with friends, tossing his shoes into the hallway without a thought, I studied him. Really studied him. His carefree stride, his careless words, the way he brushed past me as though I were invisible. I saw clearly that he expected me to fade into the background until the day came when he could collect what he believed was his due. And that was when the flicker inside me grew stronger. I began to ask myself dangerous questions. Why should I keep living like this, denying myself everything when he gave nothing in return? Why should I let him inherit a fortune of my blood and sweat when he treated me with disdain? Why should I keep saving for his tomorrow when my own today was slipping through my fingers? The questions burned, and though I didn't have the answers yet, I knew one thing. I could no longer continue as I had. The balance had shifted. That night, as I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, I realized the thought no longer frightened me. For the first time, it felt right. What if the inheritance was never his to begin with? The days that followed only confirmed what I already knew. My son had no respect for me. If anything, his arrogance seemed to sharpen, as though he could sense my shifting thoughts and responded with cruelty of his own. One evening, I returned home from another long day at work, my feet aching, my shoulders stiff from hours of lifting and standing. The moment I opened the door, I was met not with a greeting, but with his voice echoing from the living room. "You're late. There's no food. What am I supposed to eat?" I set my bag down and looked at him sprawled across the couch, phone in one hand, remote in the other. His shoes were kicked off in the middle of the floor, crumbs scattered across the cushions, and a half-empty soda can balanced on the armrest. He didn't move to help me. He didn't even look up. "I've been working all day," I said quietly, heading toward the kitchen. "You could have cooked something for yourself." He snorted. "That's your job, not mine. What do you even do if you can't keep food ready?" The words stung, but I held my tongue. I had learned that arguing with him only fueled his disdain. Still, inside, a storm was building. I had spent years thinking of myself as the provider, the caretaker, the parent who gave and gave without question. Yet now, standing in my own kitchen while he sat there like a king waiting to be served, I saw what he really thought of me. a servant, a burden when I failed to meet his expectations. Ah, it didn't stop there. He began making comments more openly, little jabs laced with contempt. When are you going to fix this dump of a house? No wonder no one comes over. This place is embarrassing. Don't you ever think about how lazy it looks when you don't keep up? Lazy. The word nearly made me laugh, bitter and hollow. Lazy. When my hands were raw from labor, when my body was a map of aches and scars from years of sacrifice. He borrowed money without asking, took food from the fridge without gratitude, and left messes wherever he went. And when I reminded him of the inheritance, of the savings I had poured my life into, his response chilled me. Yeah, I know. That's the least you can do after everything I've had to put up with here. The least I could do. I remember standing there, clutching a dish towel in my hand, staring at him in disbelief. He had no idea. No idea of the nights I had cried from exhaustion, the birthdays I had worked through, the meals I had gone without. In his eyes, I was simply a stepping stone, something to tolerate until he got what he wanted. And in that moment, I knew the tide had fully turned. He thought I was his burden, but he had no idea what I was becoming. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful. The sun streamed through the windows, warm and golden, but inside the house, the air was heavy with tension. I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, methodically stacking his clothes into neat piles while he lounged in the living room playing a video game. He called out without looking away from the screen, his voice sharp and demanding, "Hey, don't mix my shirts with yours. They'll smell like your room." The words cut deeper than he realized, or maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. My hands froze mid-fold, the fabric dangling between my fingers. I turned slowly, watching him slouched in his chair, his eyes glued to the television, his fingers tapping at the controller like he hadn't just sliced me open with another careless insult. I stared at the pile of clothes before me. Each shirt, each pair of jeans represented hours of work. They had been bought with paychecks that came from aching muscles and sleepless nights. And yet, to him, they were nothing. To him, I was nothing. In that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger, not the wild kind that flares and dies quickly. This was colder, steadier, a realization so sharp it left me trembling. I had spent years breaking myself to build his future, convincing myself it was love, convincing myself he would one day understand. But the truth was right in front of me. He never would. He didn't see my sacrifice as love. He saw it as obligation. He saw me as an obstacle, a servant, a burden to tolerate, until I finally left him with the inheritance he believed was his right. I put down the shirt I was holding and sat back in the chair. For the first time in years, I let myself ask the forbidden question, what if I stopped? What if I stopped cooking for him, cleaning after him, saving for him, living only for him? What if I stopped pouring my life into someone who only poured scorn back into me? The thought was terrifying, but at the same time, it was liberating. My chest tightened, then loosened, as if shackles I hadn't realized I was wearing were finally breaking. I didn't have to keep sacrificing. I didn't have to keep giving. I didn't have to keep waiting for respect that would never come. That afternoon, while he shouted at his game, cursing the screen, I made my decision. Quietly, firmly, without fanfare, I decided I would no longer live for him. My life, my sacrifices, my money, none of it would be his by default. For the first time in decades, I chose myself. And though he didn't know it yet, the course of both our lives had just changed forever. Once the decision settled in me, it was like a quiet fire that would not burn out. Every time my son spoke with disdain, every time he dismissed me or treated me like little more than a servant, the flame grew steadier, stronger. For years I had told myself I was powerless, that the sacrifices I made were unavoidable. But now I realized I held the one thing he truly valued: the money, the inheritance, the nest egg I had built with my blood and sweat. For so long, I had thought of it as his. I had even referred to it that way in my own mind. His future, his inheritance, his safety. But as I began to turn the thought over in my mind, I felt something shift. It wasn't his at all. It was mine. Every dollar had been earned by me, carried home in aching muscles and sleepless nights. Why should he believe it belonged to him simply because I had given him life? That thought gave me strength, and strength led to action. I began slowly, carefully. Late at night, after he had gone to bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with the old laptop, its keys worn from years of use. My hands trembled as I logged into the bank account I had rarely touched except to deposit. Line after line of numbers stared back at me, a testament to decades of sacrifice. It wasn't a fortune by the world's standards, but to me, it was everything. And to him, it was a ticket to freedom, or at least it would have been. I studied the accounts, the savings bonds, the modest investments I had made. My husband and I had started some of them together before he passed, and I had continued them alone. I had always imagined one day transferring it to our son, watching him step into life with more security than either of us had known. Now I looked at those numbers and thought of what they could mean for me instead. A new home, a fresh start, a chance to live without the constant weight of being dismissed. But I was careful. I knew that if I acted too rashly, he would notice. He was entitled, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He expected that money to be waiting for him. So I began to research. I read about withdrawals, transfers, ways to reallocate funds into accounts under my name alone. I studied real estate listings in secret, allowing myself the guilty pleasure of imagining living in one of those homes. Bright kitchens, wide windows, clean bedrooms that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Each night, as the house grew quiet, I planned. I built the idea piece by piece, as carefully as I had once built his future. But this time, it was mine. And though I hadn't made the first move yet, I knew it was only a matter of time. The money wasn't his inheritance anymore. It was my escape. The more I thought about it, the more the plan began to feel not only possible, but justified. At first, guilt clung to me like a shadow. A parent isn't supposed to take from their child. A parent is supposed to give, to nurture, to sacrifice, until there's nothing left. For so long I had believed that. I had built my entire identity around it. But after everything he had said, after every sneer, every dismissal, every careless insult, I finally asked myself the question I had been avoiding for years. Why should I leave him everything when he treats me like nothing? The answer was simple. I shouldn't. I sat with that thought for days, rolling it over in my mind, testing its weight. At first it felt dangerous, almost wicked, as though I were betraying some sacred duty. But then I would hear his voice again. Your room stinks. That's your job. This place is embarrassing, and the guilt would evaporate, replaced by something far stronger. Clarity. It wasn't betrayal. It was balance. For years I had given him everything, and in return, he had given me nothing but contempt. What kind of parent continues to pour into a cup that only spills its contents onto the ground? What kind of fool gives away the very life they worked for to someone who spits on it? I thought about the inheritance fund as I folded laundry, as I washed dishes, as I scrubbed the bathroom tiles. I pictured him years from now, swaggering into adulthood with that money, not as a man who had earned it, but as a boy who had been handed everything. He would squander it, I knew. He would waste it on luxuries, burn it on whims, never understanding the value behind it. And worse, he would never learn respect. Giving him the inheritance would not honor my sacrifices, it would mock them. But what if I used it for myself? The thought no longer frightened me. In fact, it felt almost righteous. For once in my life, I could live with dignity. I could buy a bed that didn't sag, curtains that didn't hang limp and faded, furniture that didn't carry the weight of decades. I could breathe in a home that didn't echo with his contempt. And more than that, I could show him something he had never considered, that I wasn't a servant, a wallet, or a stepping stone. I was a person with the right to live well. Every time he tossed another insult my way, my resolve strengthened. Every time he rolled his eyes, every time he acted as though I owed him the world, I reminded myself he has treated me like nothing. I owe him nothing, and soon he would see just how much that nothing was worth. The day I finally moved from thought to action felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I woke before dawn, the house still cloaked in silence, my son snoring down the hall. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup of coffee, staring at the folder of documents I had gathered in secret. Bank statements, account numbers, identification papers, all neatly organized, as if the act of preparing them could steady my racing heart. This was it. I had planned carefully, studying every step. I knew exactly how much was in each account, which funds were joint from long ago and which were solely mine, how to transfer without raising suspicion. I wasn't stealing. These were my earnings, my sacrifices, my sweat embedded into every dollar. For years I had told myself they belonged to him, but now I knew better. They belonged to me, and I was simply reclaiming what I had always deserved. When the bank opened, I was the first one through the doors. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the counter, but my voice was steady. I'd like to make some changes to my accounts. The teller smiled politely, clicking through screens, asking questions in a rehearsed, professional tone. And one by one, I answered. I transferred balances from savings bonds into my personal account. I closed an investment account I had left untouched for decades, signing papers with a hand that no longer shook. I withdrew a portion in cash enough to make me feel the weight of it in my purse, the physical proof of my decision. The rest, I moved into a new account under my name alone, protected, untouchable. Each click of the keyboard, each stamp of approval was like a hammer striking through the chains I had worn for years. I half expected someone to stop me, to ask if I was sure, to scold me for daring to think of myself. But no one did. The transactions were legal, clean, precise. The teller simply smiled as she handed me the final receipt, unaware that she had just witnessed the unraveling of a lifetime of sacrifice. Walking out of that bank, the morning sun brighter than it had been in years, I felt lighter. The money was no longer a future he believed was guaranteed. It was my present, my freedom, my escape. When I arrived home, my son was still sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, crumbs scattered around him. He barely glanced at me. "Did you pick up groceries?" he asked, not even bothering to look away from his screen. I smiled faintly, slipping the envelope of cash deeper into my bag, the secret safe with me. "Yes," I said, though I hadn't. He didn't notice the change in me, Not yet. He didn't see the spark of triumph in my eyes. But soon he would, because, with one quiet morning at the bank, I had erased his future and rewritten mine. The search began quietly, almost timidly, as though I were sneaking glances at a forbidden desire. Late at night, when my son had vanished into the glow of his games or scrolled endlessly through his phone, I would sit at the old laptop and type in words I never thought would belong to me. Homes for sale near the coast, modern houses with big windows, peaceful neighborhoods. At first, it felt like a fantasy. I would scroll through pictures of polished hardwood floors, gleaming kitchens and bedrooms bigger than the entire space I slept in now. I imagined myself there, imagined sunlight spilling across freshly painted walls, imagined opening a window and breathing in air that smelled of the sea, not of stale dust and resentment. Then one evening, I saw it. The listing stopped me in my tracks. A 2-story house, whitewashed walls with soft blue shutters, surrounded by a tidy garden that looked as though it had been waiting for someone to care for it. The pictures inside were even more breathtaking. Wide windows stretched from floor to ceiling, flooding every room with golden light. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances, countertops spotless and inviting. The living room was open and airy, not cramped and dim like the one I had endured for years. And the bedroom, my bedroom, was vast, with clean walls, polished floors, and a view of the sunrise. It wasn't just a house. It was freedom, hope, and dignity wrapped into 4 walls and a roof. It was everything my old place was not. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. I could picture myself walking barefoot across that smooth floor, brewing coffee in that perfect kitchen, opening the curtains to let in sunlight without worrying about sagging fabric or mildew. I could picture laughter echoing against the bright walls, not insults muttered under breath. For the first time in years, I could picture peace. The price was steep, but not impossible. With the inheritance money I had secured, it was within reach, within my reach. My lips curved into a smile I hadn't felt in so long, a real one, not the forced expression I wore for the sake of keeping the peace. This wasn't just about buying a house. It was about reclaiming my life. Every inch of that home represented a choice to stop living in shadows, to stop carrying the weight of a son who thought so little of me, to stop enduring when I had the means to flourish. I bookmarked the listing, my fingers lingering on the mouse, reluctant to close it. The glow from the screen reflected in my eyes, and for the first time, I allowed myself to whisper aloud the truth that had been building in my chest. This isn't his future anymore. It's mine. The dream home wasn't just a discovery. It was a promise. The day I signed the papers felt like stepping into a world I had never been allowed to imagine for myself. My palms were damp, my pulse steady but quick, like a drumbeat guiding me forward. The realtor, a cheerful woman in her 40s with a voice like velvet, slid the documents across the polished table toward me. "Once you sign here," she said, tapping the bottom of the page with her manicured finger, "this home will officially be yours." Mine. The word echoed in my head with a sweetness I couldn't put into words. For years, everything I had earned, everything I had saved, had been earmarked for him. It was never mine. It was always his future, his security, his safety net. And now, with the stroke of a pen, all of that changed. This home wasn't for him. It wasn't for anyone but me. I took the pen slowly, savoring the moment. The tip hovered above the paper for just a second longer, my breath held tight in my chest. Then, with a firm motion, I wrote my name, each letter bold, final, unstoppable. By the time I lifted the pen, I felt as though I had just carved a new identity into existence. The realtor smiled, gathering the papers with practiced ease. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "It's a beautiful home, and I think you're going to be very happy there." Happy. How long had it been since I had truly known the meaning of that word? I walked through the house again after the closing, this time not as a visitor or a dreamer, but as its owner. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher. The hardwood floor creaked softly under my steps, a sound that felt welcoming, like the home itself was acknowledging me. I opened the windows, and the breeze rushed in, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers from the garden. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped in a space that reeked of compromise and stale bitterness. I felt alive. I ran my hands along the smooth walls, as though to reassure myself it was real. I lingered in the kitchen, imagining breakfast made for myself alone, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air. I stepped into the bedroom, stood by the wide window, and watched the light flood across the floor. This was my sanctuary, my fresh beginning, my proof that life could still be beautiful. As I stood there, my chest filled with something I hadn't felt in so long: satisfaction. Not the tired satisfaction of making ends meet, of scraping through another month, but the deep, undeniable satisfaction of finally, truly living for myself. I whispered into the sunlit room, "This is mine, all mine," and the house seemed to echo back, silently, a promise. "You belong here." Moving day felt like the shedding of an old skin. My old house, the place that had witnessed years of sacrifice and scorn, now looked smaller, more suffocating than ever. Every corner reeked of memories. I no longer wished to carry nights of working late, of scraping meals together, of enduring my son's dismissive words. As I closed the door behind me for the last time, I felt no sadness, only relief. The dream home greeted me like a friend I had always known but never met. Sunlight poured across the entryway as though it had been waiting for me to arrive. The air was light, fresh, scented faintly with new paint and polished wood. I stepped inside with boxes in my arms, but it wasn't the weight of them I noticed. It was the weight that had lifted from my shoulders. The transformation began immediately. I didn't want to simply move into this house. I wanted to make it a reflection of the life I had denied myself for so long. I painted the living room walls a soft, calming cream, bright enough to reflect the light but warm enough to embrace me at the end of the day. I chose curtains that billowed like sails when the windows were open, letting the breeze dance freely through the space. The kitchen, once only a place for hurried meals, became the heart of my sanctuary. I stocked the cupboards with ingredients I actually enjoyed cooking with: rich olive oils, fragrant herbs, fresh produce. For the first time, I cooked not out of obligation but out of pleasure, humming as I stirred pots and baked bread that filled the house with the scent of home. In the bedroom, I invested in a bed large and soft, dressed with crisp linen sheets that whispered of comfort. I placed a vase of fresh flowers by the window, their colors shifting with the sun's passage. At night, I lay there surrounded not by clutter and the stale air of disappointment, but by peace. Every piece of furniture, every decoration was chosen carefully, not for necessity, but for joy. A plush armchair by the window for reading, a small fountain in the garden, its trickling water a lullaby of serenity. Photographs of landscapes I had always admired but never visited, reminders that dreams were not childish but essential. And most of all, I filled the home with silence, not the bitter silence of resentment, but the sweet, clean silence of solitude. It was mine alone, undisturbed, untainted. Each evening, I walked through the rooms with a glass of wine in hand, letting the glow of sunset spill across my walls. I looked around and smiled. This was the harvest of every sleepless night, every penny saved, every insult endured. I had given and given until I was empty. But now, at last, I was full. This wasn't just a house. This was freedom realized. The knock on the door came earlier than expected, sharp and impatient, the kind that carried arrogance instead of courtesy. I had been sitting at the dining table, sipping coffee while the morning light streamed in. When I heard it, my stomach tightened. I knew immediately who it was. When I opened the door, there he stood, my son, his expression curled into that same mixture of boredom and entitlement he always wore. His eyes flicked past me, immediately taking in the gleaming interior, the wide windows, the polished floors. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he had arrived at the wrong address. "Whose house is this?" he asked bluntly, pushing past me without waiting for an answer. His sneakers squeaked against the spotless floor as he walked deeper inside, his gaze darting from one immaculate room to the next. "It's mine," I said calmly, shutting the door behind him. He stopped mid-step, turning back to me with disbelief etched on his face. "Yours? You're joking. There's no way you could afford this, unless—" He froze, realization dawning. His jaw tightened. "The inheritance. You used my inheritance money." The bitterness in his voice clashed with the serenity of my home, but I didn't let it shake me. I crossed the living room slowly, letting him take it all in. The freshly painted walls, the new furniture, the vase of flowers blooming on the windowsill. Everything about this space radiated peace, the exact opposite of the scorn he had hurled at me not long ago. "My inheritance," I repeated softly, tasting the words as though they belonged to someone else. "You mean the money I spent years earning, the savings I sacrificed for, the nest egg I built by denying myself every comfort so that one day you could stand on your own?" He flinched at my tone, but his arrogance didn't waver. "That money was supposed to be for me, for my future. You had no right to touch it." I set my coffee cup down on the table, its soft clink echoing in the silence. "No right? I had every right. It was never yours. It was mine. And after the way you've treated me, after the way you mocked the very roof over my head, tell me, why should I have given you everything while living with nothing?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes flicked around the house again, this time not with wonder, but with resentment. I let the silence stretch, savoring the shift of power. For once, he was the one speechless, the one caught off guard. "This house," I said finally, my voice steady, "is the life I should have given myself a long time ago. Not for you, not for anyone else, for me." The son's face hardened, his entitlement colliding with the reality before him. The truth was undeniable. The dream home was real, and it was mine. His voice cracked through the air like a whip. "What did you do with my money?" My son's face reddened as his fists clenched at his sides. He looked less like a man and more like a child who had just had his favorite toy taken away. His eyes darted around the room as if the furniture, the art on the walls, and the very air itself would confirm his suspicions. I stayed seated, calm, deliberate, my coffee still warm in my hands. "It was never your money," I replied, each word slow, heavy, unshaken. He slammed his palm against the edge of the dining table, the sound echoing through the house. "Don't play games with me. You promised all those years. You said you were saving for my future. That was supposed to be my inheritance, mine." His voice cracked on the last word, spitting it like venom. I studied him for a long moment, the way his lips curled with entitlement, the way his eyes burned not with loss but with greed. He wasn't mourning a betrayal, he was mourning his convenience. "I saved for you," I said, leaning forward, "because I believed you would respect what I had worked for. I believed you would honor the sacrifices I made. But you don't see me as a parent, do you? You see me as a bank account, as a stepping stone, and I will not allow myself to be treated like that any longer." He scoffed, pacing the room like a caged animal. "So you blew it all on yourself? A house? Furniture? Some fantasy life? You ruined everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I set the cup down, meeting his gaze squarely. "Yes, I gave myself the life I deserve." His nostrils flared. He jabbed a finger toward me, trembling with fury. "You're selfish. After everything I've endured, you decide to betray me? You'd rather waste it all than secure your own son's future?" The laugh escaped me before I could stop it, not out of humor but disbelief. "Your future?" I shook my head. "You had every chance to build your own. I worked myself to the bone so you could have opportunities I never had. And instead of gratitude, you gave me mockery. You stood in my home and sneered at the roof over my head, at the walls that sheltered you. You told me my room stank, and with those words, you revealed just how little I meant to you." His lips parted, but no excuse came. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. I rose to my feet, the silence between us as sharp as broken glass. "This money was never yours, and from this day forward, I will no longer apologize for choosing myself." The sun's fury boiled over into silence, the kind that trembles with the weight of unspoken words. For the first time, he was powerless. The silence between us was thick, vibrating with the raw tension of everything unsaid. My son stood rigid, his face flushed with anger, his mouth twitching as though desperate to unleash another tirade. But I didn't give him the chance. I straightened my back, my voice steady, calm, and firm. "You mocked me for living humbly. Do you remember that day? You sneered at the small room I had called home for years, the room I sacrificed in to keep food on the table, the room where I stitched together our lives through endless nights of work. You told me it stank. You spat those words like I was something beneath you." His jaw tightened, but I continued, refusing to be interrupted. "You'll get nothing from me but the lesson of respect. That is your inheritance, and it will be worth more to you than any pile of money ever could. Because wealth, without respect for the people who built it, is nothing more than rot. It will crumble in your hands, the way entitlement has already begun to crumble your character." I stepped closer, my voice quiet but unrelenting. "I wore the same coat for 10 winters so you could have new clothes each school year. I worked double shifts and ate scraps while you dined without worry. I said no to myself so that I could say yes to you. Every dollar I saved was a piece of my time, a piece of my health, a piece of my life, and you treated it all as though it belonged to you by right." His eyes flickered, a shadow of discomfort flashing across them, but his lips curled with defiance. I didn't stop. "Money is not love. Money is not respect. I gave you love. I gave you sacrifice. I gave you a chance to grow into someone who could stand tall on their own. But instead of gratitude, you gave me contempt. You mocked the very foundation of the life I bled for." I gestured around the room, at the sunlight spilling across the walls, at the air that carried the scent of fresh flowers instead of mold. "So now I live for me. This house, this peace, this joy, it is not your loss, it is my gain, and I will not apologize for it." His mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a plea. but I raised a hand, silencing him. You need to understand this truth whether you like it or not. Respect is earned, not demanded. You may inherit my name, but you will not inherit my labor. Not until you learn to honor the people who carried you before you could walk. Not until you understand that no one owes you anything simply because you exist and are. The words hung in the air like stone, unmovable, unshakable. I looked at him with steady eyes. Your inheritance is gone. What remains is the only thing that can save you the lesson. Do with it what you will. Days turned into weeks after that confrontation, and though my new home filled me with peace, I could not help but hear faint echoes of my son's fury. He left that day with his pride intact, or so he thought. But pride, without foundation, collapses quickly. Word reached me slowly. At first, he tried to keep up appearances. He boasted to friends that he had investments, that his future was secure. But the truth unraveled faster than he could spin it. His rent went unpaid, his car was repossessed, the parties he once flaunted dried up, and so did the people who clung to him only for the glow of money he didn't actually have. Soon, desperation replaced arrogance. He came knocking again, but this time his fists weren't pounding with anger. They were weak, hesitant. I opened the door to find him thinner, clothes wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He tried to smirk, but his lips trembled. You've made your point. Now, can I at least have a little to get back on my feet? The sight tugged at me, but I stayed rooted. You're an adult, I said firmly. Your feet are your responsibility. He scoffed, but it was hollow. You think you're teaching me some lesson, but all you're doing is ruining me. His voice cracked with the weight of reality pressing in. Do you know what it's like to watch everything slip away? To have people look at you like you're nothing because you have nothing? I held his gaze. Yes, I know it well. The difference is, I fought through it. I built something from nothing. And now it's your turn. Maybe you'll finally understand that the world owes you nothing. He turned his face away, shame flickering where arrogance used to reside. The silence that followed told me the truth. He was unraveling, forced to face the consequences of a life built on entitlement. I learned from neighbors that he borrowed money he couldn't repay, that his name was whispered not with admiration but with pity. Friends abandoned him, opportunities closed their doors, and slowly he became a ghost of the man he thought he was. One evening, I saw him sitting on a park bench as I passed by. He looked smaller somehow, hunched, lost in thought. He didn't see me, but I saw him. And in that moment, I realized the lesson had landed, whether he admitted it or not. He was confronting himself for the first time, stripped of excuses and wealth that was never his. The son who once sneered, "Your room stinks," now had no room at all. It was a harsh truth, but it was the only path left for him to grow. His downfall wasn't my punishment, it was his own making, the inevitable consequence of believing the world would hand him everything without giving anything in return. The morning light streamed through the wide windows of my dream home, painting the walls with gold. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee rising from the mug in my hands, and let myself simply breathe. For the first time in decades, the weight on my shoulders had lifted. No late shifts, no endless calculations of how much could be saved for someone else's future. This life was mine, carved from years of sacrifice, and finally lived without guilt. I walked through each room with quiet pride. Sunlight filled the living room, where books lined the shelves and a soft armchair waited for me by the window. The garden outside was alive with color, flowers I planted blooming, as though they too had been waiting for my arrival. Every corner spoke not of excess, but of peace, a space that belonged entirely to me, where I could rest, reflect, and savor the rewards of perseverance. The echo of my son's words, "Your room stinks," was long gone. Instead, laughter from visiting neighbors, the hum of life beyond my doors, and the simple serenity of silence replaced it. My room no longer stank, it glowed, and it was not bought with entitlement, but with resilience. Some nights, I thought of him. I wondered whether the lesson had settled in his heart, whether he had begun to understand what respect and gratitude truly meant. But even in those moments, I felt no guilt. I had done what needed to be done, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. To continue giving to someone who only took would have been to erase myself completely, and I refused to vanish in service of someone who could not see my worth. Here, in this house, I learned that love for oneself is not selfishness. It is survival. It is dignity. For too long, I had lived believing that my sacrifices were proof of my devotion. But devotion without respect is a prison, and I finally stepped free. Every day now began with gratitude, not for what I had given away, but for what I had reclaimed: my time, my energy, my joy. I planted flowers. I cooked meals for myself without rushing. I sat on the porch at night and listened to the world hum gently around me, and when I closed my eyes, I felt peace rather than worry. The inheritance that was once meant for him had instead become an inheritance for me, a reward for decades of labor and love, redirected to the person who had truly earned it. I no longer lived in a cramped, dim space that carried the scent of mold and sacrifice. I lived in sunlight. I lived in freedom. I lived, finally, for myself. And as I stood on the balcony of my dream home, the horizon stretching wide and endless before me, I smiled. For the first time in my life, the future was mine. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.